Alright, so in this video we're going to make a really simple web page which allows users to sign up and create an account, and also to sign in with an existing account so that they can see hidden secret content that they're only allowed to see if they are actually authenticated. So this is what I've done earlier. So for example, if they put in an email and a password and then click sign in, it will say, yep, you've signed in, if they have an existing account that they've made. And it'll say, yes, here's the secret content that you can only see once you're authenticated. Then they can sign out, and same again. And they can sign up in the first place to create that account, and that will all be managed by Firebase underneath in the background. So this is going to be a real simple app. We're not going to use a front-end framework like React or anything like that. We're going to keep it as simple as possible, just one small page of HTML, because that's enough as it is. It's complicated enough as it is. The purpose of this is for learning how authentication works with Firebase. If you're going to make a full web app, you're going to want something more involved and that is more secure than what we're doing today. But this is just to get you started and to get you introduced to Firebase Authentication in the simplest way that we possibly can. So let's dive straight into it. Assuming you know how to make an HTML document, I've made one called Auth. Let's give it a title. Let's call it Authentication is Fun, because it is. It's awesome. So I'm going to just make a couple of divs. That's where we're going to start. So a div for the form where people sign up or sign in, and a div for all that top secret hidden content that they only see once they are signed in. So let me just give these IDs so that we can refer to them later. So I'll just call this one auth form, and here I'll call this one secret content. So our two divs. And then inside this form, let's just put a, let's do an H2 maybe, so I'll just say sign up, or sign in if they already have an account. And there'll be an input for their email and an input for their password, and then some buttons. A button that says sign up if they don't have an account, and we'll have a button that says sign in if they already do have an existing account. Let's check that. Always good to check. Let's open this up in the browser, and let's get rid of the old one that we've already made. Let's open up our new one. So it's just got the heading and then two input fields for the email and password with either a sign up or a sign in button. I think I'd like these underneath to make it a bit tidier. And we need some more information would be useful on these input fields as well. So let me put a break or two here, just to bring down the buttons underneath. And then in the input field here, let's give it a type, and say that this is our email type. And what that does is it just sort of guides the user for entering an email address into that input field by prompting them if they don't have an @ symbol or if it doesn't look like an email address. But we'll also put in a placeholder, and we'll just say email, to sort of so that the text shows up to say, yeah, this is the email input box, so they know which is which. And I'm also going to give it an ID because our JavaScript later on is going to try and find this element from our HTML, and it's good to have an ID to do that. So we'll just call this user email to distinguish from the other words that all have email in them. And the same here, we'll give this a password type. This second input field, we'll say it's a password type, and that'll sort of cover up what you're typing with little dots in case someone is sneakily looking over your shoulder to steal your password. That's important. And we'll call it password as the placeholder to guide them to write their password into that input field, and we will say user password as the ID, so that we can refer to it later. And then let's give these buttons IDs as well. That's important. This is the sign up button, So I'm using camel casing each new word starting with a capital letter, but the first letter is lowercase. That's just a convention, but conventions are actually really useful, so let's use them. And this is the sign in button. Okay, so we're set up with that. In the secret content, let's just put something real simple for now, just to get the idea. This is top secret information that you can only see if, let's do a bigger word, there's an H1, authenticated. Alright, so let's just have a look at what that all looks like. I'm going to save this and refresh. Okay, so a lot going on, but you can see we've got the email has got the placeholder email in it, and the password's got the placeholder password. If I start typing a password, it's acting like a password input with covering up the text. And if I try writing a new email here, it's going to prompt me to say please include an @ symbol. If I include an @ symbol, it's going to say yeah, you need more than that. So it's just guiding me towards putting an email address in there to prevent any errors that the user might make. Now obviously we don't want this to show normally, that we'll have to wait for the person to sign in. That's the idea, or to sign up first and then sign in. But at the moment we're just putting everything there, so all the HTML is ready. And we've got our sign up and sign in buttons as well. Actually, I will just add one thing, and that is once they are signed in, we want a button here that enables them to sign out so that they can sign out once they've finished. And we'll give this button an ID as well, and obviously we'll call this one the sign out button. Alright, so that's our HTML set up. This video is not about CSS, but I can't really tolerate it looking this bad. So I'm just going to put style tag up there in the head of my HTML document, and we'll do some very basic CSS. Sorry if I'm rushing, but I want to get to the JavaScript, which is the fun bit, and actually connecting with Firebase, because that's what this video is about. So the body, we'll just style the whole body together. I'm just going to text align center it, so put everything in the center. And let's give it a background color. I'm quite into light sea green at the moment, just because life is stressful and that is nice and calming. For some reason it's a calming color, I don't know. And the text, let's make it readable though, so black. I mean white could work as well. Anyway, let's not talk CSS because that's not the point of this. But if I save that, at least it's you know, tolerable to look at. And also just clearer, easier for us to use. Alright, so with the HTML being set up, let's actually get into connecting to Firebase and making a Firebase project and connecting this HTML to Firebase in the background. So make a Firebase account if you haven't already. It's through Google, it's very easy to do. You create a new project, we'll give it a name, and it's as simple as that. We just make the project. We don't need Google Analytics. This is just a demo project. And once that's done, we can have a look at all of the toys that we can play with. We're going to want to make this an app. So adding the app, it's not for mobile, it's for web. So we click on the web button here. And I just like to call it the same thing. You could register the app as something different, but I just like to use the same title. Okay, and now we're good to go. We're going to come back to all this later, so that code we can come back to. I'm just going to get off that for the moment. Because the most important part, once you've got your Firebase project, is this bit here, the build. All of these things that we can do in the build section. So you're creating databases, storage, etc. But today we're talking about authentication. So we're going to click on authentication, and we're going to say, yeah, let's get started. Let's do it. Let's do this thing. Let's get started and enable authentication. So lots of different ways to authenticate. We're just going to keep it simple for today. That's the point of this. Nice and simple with email and password. But this is essential. You must enable authentication through email and password in your Firebase app. So I'm going to save those changes. Great. So now let's connect our Firebase to, I'm going to go to the project settings, the little cog up here, project settings. And if we scroll down in the project settings, it'll give us some code here that will allow us to connect our Firebase to our HTML web page that we're making. Now don't click on npm or leave it as npm because we're not going to install Firebase. We're not going to do the whole npm thing. We want this to be as simple as possible. So we're going to use cdn here. This configuration, this is the configuration for our actual app, but you'll notice that's included in here. But the CDN one, not only does it have the script tags that we can just paste into our HTML file to get the JavaScript part of our HTML document happening, but it's also got the full web URL, so we can get all that good stuff from Firebase just directly through that URL connector. So let's just copy all of this, and it's good to go. So in the remember in the CDN, copy all of that code, and it's as simple as that. We're just going to paste this in to our HTML document. By the way, all of this code, this whole code, it's all in the description. Just click on the link in the description if you want all the code for this whole thing. It's all there. But it's the code that's there in the link. It's not going to work for you until you configure it and you put your Firebase configuration in there. Okay, now that we've pasted that in, what we've got is we've imported things like this initialize app function from Firebase, which allows us to connect what we're doing to the Firebase library. So that's good, but we're not done. We also need to import a whole lot of other things from the same place, really. So I'm going to copy this, but not quite. I'm going to have to make a change. So I'm going to copy all of that. We're still importing this new stuff from Firebase, but because this is authentication, we're not importing it from the app bit of Firebase. We're importing it from the auth, the authentication part of this Firebase library. So that's really important that we change app to auth here for this little bit. And there's a few different things that we want to import. So let's give ourselves some space. The first thing is just this thing where we get all the good authentication stuff. So get auth, that's the first thing we want to import from Firebase Authentication to allow us to basically get started in enabling authentication on our web page. The next thing that we want to import is the function where we can actually create a user with, so camel casing every new word at the start of a new word with a capital letter, with email and password. Now I'm not making these up. These are existing functions in Firebase, so make sure that the spelling is exactly correct. Once we've created a user, we want that user to be able to sign in with email and password. So this is functionality we're importing from Firebase Authentication. We want to know whether they are signed in or not, and that's called the authentication state. So we want to be able to do things if that authentication state changes from signed in to signed out at any point. So that's the on auth state changed functionality, and the last one is just for them to be able to sign out. So sign out, that's another thing that we want to be able to do with this little web page. So these 5 things we're importing from Firebase Auth. Okay, so that being done, you can see down here what the other thing that we've copied here is this thing where we are initializing the app in the first place. And so that is taking our web page, initializing the Firebase, but with our particular configuration in there. So all this stuff here, that is configuration for the Firebase app that you have just created, and that'll obviously be different for you. In Firebase, by the way, that you can also find this here. That's the actual important bit. This is the config bit as part of this whole CDN. So when we initialize the app, we're initializing it to your particular Firebase app that you've set up. But we also want to have a variable called auth, and that is going to store this thing, the get auth functionality from Firebase. But what are we going to pass in here? To enable authentication in our app, we're going to pass in the app variable that we just made before. So that's going to, it's going to allow authentication in our app, but authentication for our app specifically that's been initialized and configured to this particular project that we have just created. So it's setting up your Firebase account and the app that you have just made and the particular project that you've just made to connect to your HTML document that you're creating. Cool. So with all that set up, I think we're good to go, and we're good to actually write the code that we want to write for our web page. So firstly, we're just going to define a whole lot of things. We're going to make a whole lot of variables, finding elements from our document. So let's start with the user email here. Let's call this one, I like to keep it the same. User email equals, and I'm going to grab it from the document. So document dot, now I like to use the query selector method. User email, this variable, user email equals document dot query selector, and then it's a string. And hashtag, the hashtag indicates that it's an ID that we're trying to select when we query the document. And we called that thing user email. That was the ID that we gave it. So I'm talking about this element here, where the user types in their email address. That we've given it, that input field, we've given it the ID user email. So this method here is going to allow me to grab that from the document. You don't have to use it. There's one called getElementById, which actually seems more common, but I prefer query selector. You don't need to use the hashtag if you're using getElementById, but I like the hashtag, and it's the same when you're using CSS, so I just like it consistent in that way. But that's just me. Be careful when you're copying and pasting, but we've got a lot of similar variables to make. So if you copy and pasting, be careful, because you just have to make sure you do actually make all the changes that you need to make. But let's call this variable user password, and let's grab from our document the user password ID, which is that input field where they stored their password. And then let's also grab the whole form, this whole div. Remember, we want to hide that div once they've signed in, so we want to be able to do something with that. So I think I called it auth form, didn't I? Equals, so document dot query selector hashtag auth form. I will just check, that is what I called it, isn't it? Auth form, yep. So we'll grab that. But then there was the secret content one as well, wasn't there? So let's call this secret content. Oops. This variable. I like the variables to be called the same thing. If that confuses you and you want different names for the variables compared to the IDs, then do that. But for me, I like it kept the same. I like to use the ID name as the variable name. Again, that's just my preference, but you don't have to do that. But the important thing is that these ID names are correct, and that you are grabbing the element from the HTML that you want to grab and store in a variable. The reason we do this is so that we can use these variables in our JavaScript code later on. Okay, so then we've also got all these buttons to make. So we have or variables to make. So we had the sign up button, and that was the ID was exactly that. Sign up button. Different functionality. So when we click that button, we're going to have a different function for the sign up button compared to the sign in button. And you must change the ID here, otherwise, really easy mistake to make is if these IDs are wrong, you're going to click on the button, nothing's going to happen because it's not grabbing the right thing from the HTML. So if you're not going to type all this out, be very careful that these are correct. and then we had the sign out button. We must change this ID so that we are grabbing the sign out button element from our HTML when we are referring to it by this variable name. So if you remember, at the moment we've got this secret content that's already visible. So one of the first things we want to do is to hide that. Now, because I've already made this variable which grabs the secret content div that I made, I can just use that variable. That's what they're there for. That's why we do this. That's why we make these variables. So secret content, I actually want to change the CSS. I'm actually using the JavaScript to change the CSS. So I'm going to say .style, .display, because at the moment the display is that we can see it, but I want the display to equal, in quotes we say none. We want none of it. We want to hide it. It's gone. So, so block is when we show something with the display, and none means we're hiding it. So the secret content is gone for now, and it should only be visible once the user signs in. So let's just save and let's just check that. You see if I refresh, yep, it's gone. So we can't see that secret content. We have to sign in or sign up first in order to see it. So let's actually write the function for signing up a new user, creating a new user. So I'm going to make a variable with the name of my function called user sign up, not singing, signing. User sign up equals, and this is going to be an asynchronous function. I think that's the best way to do this. So an asynchronous function, if you don't know what that is, don't, maybe another video for that, but this asynchronous function for waiting for something to happen before it sort of fulfills the promise, as it were. So, and then I'm going to use an arrow. Again, arrow functions are a good thing to do more learning about if you need to. But for now, just the arrow taking us to the actual code that we want in our function. You know what? It still says user sing up. Why am I obsessed with sing ups, sign ups? Okay. It's my secret singing desires coming through subconsciously. So once this function runs, we're going to make a variable which is going to be called, well, I'm going to call it sign up email, just to be specific that we're taking the email address that they're putting up, but this is going to be for them signing up, equals, and we're going to the reason that we're doing this is we're going to take the user email variable that we made before, so user email, but take note that this variable here, user email, it's grabbing the entire element from our HTML. It's grabbing all of this. And while that's useful, we want to grab that element from the HTML. It's not actually the HTML that we're interested in. It's the value of what the user actually types in as their actual email address. That's what we want. We want the email address, not the HTML element. So this variable is going to store actually what they type in there. And then we'll make another one for their password. So the sign up password variable is going to store what they type in to that password input field. So this dot value, yeah, we're taking the element from the HTML, but it's the value of what they type in there is what actually counts. Okay, our semicolons. All right, so then we actually get to now use this stuff that we've imported from Firebase, this create user with email and password function. So that's what Firebase does for us, so that's awesome. So let's use it now. And what we want to pass in here, firstly, is our auth variable. We made this up here, and that's going to grab all the functionality from Firebase and use it with our particular app. So it's going to create a user, but it's not just going to create it anywhere. It's going to create it for our app and store it in our Firebase account. That's what we want. And what is it going to store there? It's going to store, well, we'll tell it to store what the user has typed in as their email for signing up. So that's, we've just defined that. That's the value of what they type into that email input field. And then their sign up password for the same reasons. Same thing. So That's what we're going to pass into all the functionality that Firebase has for us, and it's going to create a user in the authentication part of our Firebase project, so that we know that, yeah, that user's there, and then we can authenticate them. Okay, so dot then, because it's an async function, so dot then other stuff is going to happen, assuming that all of this happens successfully. Then we can do stuff. So what do we want to do is a couple of things. Firstly, let's actually pass in this user credential, and we'll do something with that. So again, I'm going to use an arrow to take us to some more actual functional code, the code there in the fancy brackets, and we'll do a couple of things. We'll make a variable called, we'll just call it user, which is going to equal, oops, it's this whole user. Again, a lot of this is done for us. We've got this user credential, but we just want the actual user part of it, which we'll store in this user variable, and that we're going to be useful for us later on. But what we can do, what's probably a good idea to do, is just to log in the console that user, just so that we can check it out and see what it's actually creating for us. But perhaps more importantly, we actually want to give the user a success message. So let's have an alert pop up that says, yeah, your account has been created, with an exclamation mark for extra endorphins, which are important. Good. So, okay. Hopefully all of that works. We create the user with what they've put in as email and password. We get this user credential, we log it in the console, and we have the success message. If it doesn't work though, we want to catch the error. So .catch, and what happens if we catch an error? Well, we want the actual error, we want to grab that, and the code that we're going to run with it. So again, arrow, taking us to the code that's going to run. Just to make it a little bit easier, we'll make a variable called error code, which is just going to equal, we're going to take that error and the code part of it. Oops. Yeah. Hang on. Error.code is what I wanted, I think. Yeah. And then we'll grab another one, which is the error message, which is, again, grabbing that error, but the message part of it. Okay. And then we're just going to, in the console, just log what that error is so that we can go into the console and see the error code. We just made that variable, and the error message. Okay, that's hopefully going to help us out if something goes wrong. Hopefully we won't need it. Okay, great. So this is a function, our user sign up function. When do that's not going to run at the moment. It's not going to happen. Hopefully all the code is right and it works, but it's not going to happen unless we call this function. So when do we want to call the function? We want to call it when we click the sign up button. So different to the sign in function. So when we click sign up, we want this code to run. So we need to actually, we've made this variable for our sign up button element from our HTML. Let's refer to it here. The sign, all these are quite similar, so be careful with sign up, sign in, sign out. We're going to add an event listener. So this add event listener method, we're going to add that to our sign up button. And that is, we're waiting for an event. The event that we're waiting for, we'll put in quotes, is a click. We're waiting for it to be clicked, the button. And then what do we want to happen when the button is clicked? Well, we want this function to run, the user sign up function. So we will call the user sign up function. And hopefully you've spelled it better than I have, and the spelling's all correct. The user sign up function will run when we click the sign up button, because we've got that event listener now. If we don't have the event listener, the button's not going to work. Okay, so hopefully that's right. Let's save this and let's check that this actually works. Let's see how we go. So I'm going to refresh the page. Now I'm going to make up a new email address. Obviously I'm just using fake ones. I'll be Andrew today. Andrew at gmail.com. Alright, and I'm just going to put in, test123 as my password. Okay, so let's try it out. If I click sign up, what happens? It says your account has been created, so that's great. That indicates that something's working. I press OK, and then if I inspect and have a look at the console here, yeah, you can actually see, there it is, there's all the data, and some empty fields as well, about what has actually been put through to Firebase. And the fun bit is if I come to Firebase and I refresh my user, so I'm in the authentication part of Firebase here, and I'm in the users. If I refresh this, you can see, yeah, there's Andrew at gmail.com, there's when I created the account, there's when I signed in, there's my unique ID. So Firebase does all of that for us if we just write this code in our HTML. Great, that's awesome. It gets a bit easier now because signing in once an account has been created, which is what the sign in button is for, is pretty similar. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take all of this, from where I started the function. I'm going to copy all of that, and I'm just going to come down a couple of lines and just paste it. Again, be careful with copying and pasting because you have to be really careful that you are changing the things that you need to change. But what I'm going to do is change this from user sign up to user sign in. And then instead of this variable being the sign up email, I'm going to change it to the sign in email and the sign in password. Now I'm still grabbing the same thing. I'm still grabbing the user email input element from my HTML and looking at the value of whatever the user types in. But this is going to be different. This is if they are signing in with an account they've already created. So probably not 100% necessary, but I'm changing the names of these variables that I'm putting inside my sign in function, just to be clear with them being different. But don't forget to change them in here. I need to change this to sign in email, not sign up, and my sign in password. But I'm not actually using the create a user function from Firebase. What I'm wanting to use here is not create user, but sign in. So I'll change this to sign in with email and password. Remember, this is not something I've made up. This is from Firebase itself. So spelling needs to be correct. And then I don't need to console.log the user. I can get rid of that. And my alert is not going to say this. Let's be more specific. Let's say, you have signed in successfully! Exclamation for endorphins. And then the error stuff is all, that can all be the same. Okay, so now that I've created this user sign in function, again, in order for it to work, I need to call the function. So when do I want to call the function? When I click the sign in button, okay, which is separate to the sign up button. So just like before, I'm going to create an event listener. In fact, I'm just going to copy this because it's very similar again. But the event listener is not going to be for the sign up button, it's going to be for the sign in button. And the function that I want to call when I click the sign in button is not user sign up, but it's user sign in. I want this to be the function that runs. So user sign in function will run when I click the sign in button. Okay, so let's check this out. Save it and refresh. And okay, again, if I use the Andrew at Gmail email address at gmail.com when I created my account. So that is there in Firebase. So it should be able to sign me in if I use that same email address because it's already there. So test123, and I click sign in, and it says you've signed in successfully, which at the moment is the only thing that I'm asking it to do when I sign in. So that's great. Just to demo though, what if I typed in something else? What if this was not Andrew but Fred at Gmail? If I then click sign in, it doesn't give me that success message or the exclamation mark, and I don't get the endorphins. But what I will get if I inspect is I'll get an error, and it's actually telling me user not found, which is quite useful. So it's telling me what the error is. So that's great. So it means that my error thing is working as well. Okay, cool. So that's great, except remember the point of this is that once they're signed in, they can see the secret content. And that's not happening at the moment. So we're going to create another function, which is about checking their authentication state. So I'm just going to call it check auth state. So the state meaning, are they signed in or not? So const check auth state equals, we're going to make it another asynchronous function. And the arrow is going to take us to the curly brackets and the code that we want to run when we call this check auth state function. And again, we're going to take advantage of the Firebase library with all of their good stuff that they've already got. OnAuth state changed is already a Firebase method that already is built in for us. So we can take advantage of this and we can, put in, again, it's the auth, so we're checking our own app. So that's what this was for before. It gets all the configuration for our own app with the Firebase configuration that we've set up. And then the other thing that we're passing in is it's actually the user. So this user that we're checking the authentication state of a specific user. And so the arrow taking us to more code. What we want to happen if the user authentication state changes depends on whether they're signed in or not. So we're going to use an if statement here. So if, and then a condition, and if that condition is met, we'll have something happening, and if it's not, we'll have something else happening. So two possibilities. If they are signed in, we want something to happen, and if they're not signed in, something else to happen. So it's actually real easy. We just put in user. If basically this means if the user exists, right? If they exist and they are signed in and everything's good, then they are basically saying if they are authenticated. So it's very existential. But if user, then great, we're good to go. We're signed in, we're authenticated. So what do we want to happen if they are authenticated? Well, we don't need that sign up or sign in form to be visible, but we do want the secret content to be visible. So remember, we've already made the variables for those two divs. We've got the auth form div and the secret content div, and we've made variables to allow us to be able to refer to them both, the auth form and the secret content. So we can just change the CSS of them, the display of them, by saying that auth form dot style dot display, if they are signed in, so if user means if they are signed in, we want that to go away. We want none of it. So let's hide the form, but let's show the secret content. So secret content dot style dot display equals, so in this context the opposite of none is block. In other words, let's show it. So that's if they are signed in. If they are not signed in, we want the opposite. We want to hide the secret content. So I'm putting this in the fancy brackets for the else block. This is if they are not signed in. Then if this condition is not met, we jump down to the else statement. And I'm pasting this, but we're going to make it the other way around. We want to show, so in other words, block the authentication form to allow them to have another go at signing in or signing up. But we want to have none of the secret content for them because we want to hide that if they are not signed in. Okay, great. Now, we're not going to call this by clicking a button. It's just we want to monitor the authentication state all the time. So I'm just going to call this function check auth state with the brackets. I'm going to call that just as it is. So that means it's basically always going to be checking, are they signed in? And if they are, then we'll show the content and hide the form, and vice versa if they are not signed in. Great, so hopefully that works. Let's give it a go. I refresh the page, and I'm authenticated. I already am, because it already knows that I was signed in as Andrew. So let's check it again. Well, I can't, because I can't sign out. Yeah, let's do the sign out function so that I can sign out. Sign out function is reasonably easy. Let's just make it here. So I'm just going to call it user sign out. User sign out. We'll make it asynchronous again. Async. And the arrow is going to take us to the block of code that we want to run. I just said sing out, which makes sense, but it's not what I mean. Sign out. I've got this obsession with singing today. So the code for signing out is just, we're just going to wait. We're just going to wait for it to happen, basically. And again, we're going to take advantage of the Firebase function. The sign out function is already there with Firebase. It's going to log that person out or change their state to be logged out. And again, we're going to take advantage of the auth setup that's already been set up for our account. And it's actually as simple as that. So if this function is called, it's just going to use the built-in functionality that Firebase already has to sign that user out and change their state accordingly. So again, it's not going to happen unless we click the sign out button. Well, that's what we want to give it instructions to do. So again, we need to add an event listener for not the sign in button, but the sign out button. And what function do we want to run? Again, it's the user sign out function that we just wrote that we want to run if they are going to sign out. Okay, so let's save and test that out, see how that's working. So again, it's automatically recognized that I am signed in as Andrew, but if I click sign out, look at that. It hides the secret content and it shows the secret form. Now, why is it doing that? Because I didn't tell it to do that in my sign out function, but when I click the sign out button, it signed me out, which meant that it changed the state. So because I am always checking the authentication state, because this function is just being called there, so it's always checking, once the authentication state has changed, so remember, Firebase is doing a lot of this for us. It's signing out and then changing the authentication state to say, yeah, you're not signed in anymore, so this user it's not meeting the conditions of this if statement. So we're going to go to the else block and we're going to show the authentication form and we're going to hide the secret content. So when I click the sign out button, it calls this function, but that also changes the authentication state, which means that the else block of code runs here instead of the if block of code. And so things change in my HTML page. Okay, so with that done, we're good. I'll demonstrate that we can also, maybe I'm not Andrew, maybe I'm Jess at gmail.com, and she also has test123, and she doesn't exist yet. Okay, so if I go to my user list, she's not there, but if I click sign up, it's going to say your account has been created and she's authenticated. Okay, and if I refresh in Firebase, you can see there she is. And if I sign her out, I can sign in as her and be authenticated again. Or if I sign out as her, I could also be Andrew. Now Andrew actually has the same password, and I can sign him in and he's authenticated as well. So very simple, but that is a starting point for what you can do with Firebase Authentication. And so you can have a web page front end that allows you to sign up new users and to sign them in and have different information show to those that are authenticated, and then allowing the users to sign out of your web page as well.